The Ardennes Forest, in Belgium, in December 1944. Along the approaches to a low ridge, the Americans called Elsenborn, German infantry moved forward through the snow to attack, many of them veterans who had been shelled many times before, on the Eastern Front and in the long retreat across France. Those veterans carried with them the single most important survival skill an infantryman can possess under artillery fire. They knew how to listen. The first ranging rounds of a bombardment usually arrive one at a time, or in a loose scatter, as the gunners find the target. That first round is, in a grim way, a gift. It is the warning that tells a man to press himself into the earth, to find the deepest fold in the ground, to get below the level where the fragments fly. Experienced men had lived through many bombardments precisely because they knew how to read those opening rounds and use the seconds they bought. On that ground, again and again, there was no opening round. There was no ranging, no scatter of shells walking closer across the snow. Instead, the whole weight of the fire arrived at once, dozens of shells in a single instant, many of them bursting not on the ground but above it, in the air overhead, so that fragments came straight down into the very scrapes and foxholes that were supposed to give shelter. There was no second of warning to react to, because by the time the sound of the guns reached the target, the shells had already arrived. When German prisoners were pulled out of that sector in the days that followed and questioned by American interrogators, a consistent theme ran through what they said. The shelling came without warning. It all came at once. There was no time to take cover. It is a strange thing for soldiers to say. Every infantryman on every front in that war lived under artillery. Shelling was not new. What these men were describing was not the fact of the bombardment, but its impossible arrival, the way it seemed to skip the beginning and start at the middle, the way the first thing they knew of it was that it was already on top of them and already killing. They were not merely saying the Americans had more guns, though the Americans usually did. They were describing something harder to put into words. They were describing fire that found them all at the same instant, with a precision and a suddenness that violated everything their experience had taught them about how a barrage was supposed to unfold. Consider what that meant for a man on the receiving end. The instinct that keeps an infantryman alive under fire is a physical reflex trained into him by survival itself. A distant thud, the faint whisper of an incoming round growing louder, and the body throws itself flat before the conscious mind has even named the danger. That reflex needs a fraction of a second to work. It needs a warning, however small. A time-on-target strike was engineered to deny the body that fraction of a second. The sound of the guns firing, miles away, cannot travel faster than the shells themselves. So the first thing a soldier heard was not the distant report of the cannon, but the shells already bursting over his own head. The trained reflex, the thing that had kept experienced men alive again and again, had nothing to act on until the killing was already underway. These were veterans undone not by inexperience, but by the fact that all their hard-won knowledge assumed a world in which barrages announced themselves. Against this kind of fire, that world had ceased to exist. 6 months earlier, the same phenomenon had been tearing apart German infantry in the hedgerows of Normandy, and a year and a half before that, it had begun to appear in Tunisia, where the German army first met the Americans in strength, and where German commanders including Erwin Rommel formed their first hard impressions of what American firepower could do. The pattern was consistent everywhere it appeared. The shells of many separate gun batteries, scattered across miles of ground, would land on a single target at the same moment, as though a single enormous weapon had fired them. No warning, no ranging, no time. So the question is not why American artillery was heavy, because heavy artillery was common, and every major army in that war fielded a great deal of it. The question is much more specific and much stranger. How did the Americans make the shells of a dozen, or 2 dozen, or in some documented cases more than a dozen, separate battalions of guns, sitting at different distances and different angles from the target, spread across miles of countryside, all strike the same patch of earth in the same second? And why could no other army in the world reliably do the same thing? Not the Germans, who had invented much of modern combined arms warfare and whose gunners were as skilled as any on the planet. Not the British, who had pioneered the scientific use of massed artillery on the Western Front a generation earlier, and whose gunnery the Americans openly admired. This was a capability the United States possessed to a degree that its allies approached but its enemies could not match at all, and the reason why one of the least is understood stories of the entire war. The answer has almost nothing to do with the guns themselves. The standard American field piece of the war, the M2A1 105mm howitzer, was a fine weapon, but it was not revolutionary, and in raw numbers the Germans and Soviets fielded artillery that was in many respects its equal or better. The answer has nothing to do with American gunners being naturally more gifted than German ones. It has nothing to do with a secret shell or a wonder weapon, though one piece of remarkable technology does enter this story near its end. The answer has to do with an idea worked out in the 1920s and 1930s at a dusty artillery school on the plains of Oklahoma by a handful of officers in an army that the rest of the world barely took seriously. An idea built around a deceptively simple question. What if the men who aimed the guns and the men who saw the target were not the same men and did not even need to be in the same place? To understand why that idea mattered, you first have to take the problem of artillery seriously, because it is far harder than it looks. A field gun of that era is an instrument of indirect fire. That means the crew serving the gun usually cannot see what they are shooting at. The target is over a hill, behind a tree line, on the far side of a ridge, miles away. The gun is pointed not at the enemy, but at the empty sky, lobbing a shell in a high arc that comes down, if everything has been calculated correctly, on a spot the gunners have never laid eyes on and will never see. This is a fundamentally different act from firing a rifle at a man you can watch through your sights. It is closer to a problem in applied mathematics than to marksmanship, and it is unforgiving. Getting a shell to land on a specific point of ground that you cannot see, from a gun that may be 4 or 5 or 6 miles away, depends on a long list of quantities, and every one of them matters. It depends on the exact distance from the gun to the target. It depends on the difference in height between the gun position and the target, because a target higher or lower than the gun changes where the shell falls. It depends on the weight of the individual shell, which varies slightly from one to the next, and on its precise shape. It depends on the temperature of the propellant charge, because warm powder burns with more force than cold powder and throws the shell farther. It depends on how worn the gun barrel is, because a barrel that has fired thousands of rounds has lost some of its punch and will shoot short unless the crew corrects for it. And it depends on the weather the shell will fly through, the air temperature, the air density, and the direction and speed of the wind at every altitude the shell passes on its long arc up and down. A crosswind pushes the shell sideways. A headwind or tailwind shortens or lengthens its flight. Get any of these wrong and the shell lands long, or short, or wide, and the men it was meant to kill walk away unharmed, warned now that the guns have found their range. The men who solved these equations were not firing blind by guesswork. They worked from firing tables, thick books of pre-computed data that told them, for a given range and a given powder charge, exactly what angle to set the barrel and how the various corrections should be applied. Later they used a clever device called a graphical firing table, a specialized slide rule marked with the ballistic data for a particular gun and shell, that let a trained man read off the correct settings quickly by sliding a cursor along a scale. These tools were essential, but by themselves, they only helped a single gun engage a single target. The far larger problem, the one that would decide battles, was how to make many guns, in many places, work together as one. For most of the history of artillery, the way you solved this was that each gun, or each small group of guns called a battery, worked more or less on its own. A battery had its own observer, its own commander, and its own methods. The observer would watch where the rounds fell, then send corrections back. Left 100, add 200, drop 50. The battery would walk its fire onto the target through a slow process of trial and error, adjusting round by round until the shells were falling where they were wanted. This worked. It had worked in one form or another since the 18th century. But it had two crippling weaknesses that would come to define the difference between the American way of war and everyone else's. The first weakness was time. Walking fire onto a target by observation took minutes, sometimes many minutes. Every ranging round that fell short or wide was a round that also announced to the enemy that fire was coming, and gave him the seconds he needed to get down, get into cover, and ride it out. The second weakness was that this method did not scale. It was hard enough to get one battery to hit a target through observed adjustment. Getting many batteries, spread across a wide front, to concentrate their fire on the same target at the same time was something close to impossible, because each battery was solving the geometry problem separately, from its own position, and there was no reliable way to knit their separate solutions together into a single coordinated strike. Massed fire, when armies attempted it, was usually pre-planned hours or days in advance, plotted carefully on maps, and fixed to a rigid timetable. It was a scheduled event, not a response. If a target of opportunity appeared, a column of troops on a road, a company forming up for a counterattack, there was no way to bring the weight of many batteries down on it quickly. The moment would pass before the guns could be brought to bear. This is the problem that a small group of American officers set out to solve, and to understand why they, of all people, solved it, you have to understand just how unpromising they were. The United States Army between the two world wars was a marginal institution. In 1939, on the eve of the largest war in human history, it ranked around 17th or 19th in the world in size, depending on how one counted, smaller than the armies of nations like Romania and Portugal. It was starved of money throughout the Great Depression. Its equipment was often obsolete, its promotions glacially slow, its officers frequently spending a decade or more at the same rank. It had almost no political constituency and very little prestige. A bright young man with ambition in 1930 was far more likely to go into business or law than into an army that offered low pay, slow advancement, and no glory. But that same obscurity had an unexpected and precious effect. In the quiet backwaters of the interwar army, at its schools and its training centers, there was something that busier and prouder armies often lacked. There was time. There was time to think hard about the last war, to study its lessons without the distraction of the next one, and there was intellectual freedom to question the way things had always been done. An officer stuck at the same rank for a decade, teaching at a school on the plains, had every reason to turn his mind to the deep problems of his profession, because there was little else to occupy an ambitious intellect. The very poverty of the interwar army made it, in certain corners, a place of unusually serious thought. And nowhere was this truer than at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Fort Sill sits on the southern plains, wide-open country that had once been frontier cavalry ground, and it was, and remains to this day, the intellectual home of American artillery. It was where artillery officers were sent to learn their craft, and, just as importantly, where the best of them were sent to teach it and to refine it. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the gunnery department of that school became the setting for one of the most consequential pieces of military problem-solving of the entire century. It happened slowly, without drama, in classrooms and on practice ranges, argued out among instructors, and tested against the stopwatch and the impact of live rounds. Almost no one outside the small world of the field artillery noticed at the time. There was no announcement, no breakthrough moment celebrated in the press. There was only a group of professional soldiers, year after year, refusing to accept that the way artillery had always been coordinated was the best way it could be done. The central figure in the early stage of this story was a field artillery officer named Carlos Brewer. As director of the gunnery department at the Field Artillery School around 1929 to 1931, Brewer became convinced that the old method of each battery adjusting its own fire by trial and error was fundamentally inadequate for the kind of war he expected to come. He wanted a way to concentrate the fire of an entire battalion, and eventually more than a battalion, quickly and accurately, on a target that a single observer had located. The obstacle was the geometry. Each of the guns in a battalion sat at a slightly different spot on the ground, and therefore each had a slightly different distance and direction to the target. There was no simple way for one man's observation to be translated into correct firing data for every gun at once. Brewer and the officers working under him developed the core of the solution, and it was elegant. Rather than have each battery work out its firing solution independently from its own position, they created a central location where all the geometry for the entire battalion would be worked out together, on a single large plotting board, using the position of every gun and the location of the target as reported by the observer. This central location came to be called the Fire Direction Center. The idea was that the forward observer, the man who could actually see the target, would no longer talk to the guns directly. He would report only what he saw and where the target was. He would send that information back to the Fire Direction Center. And the Fire Direction Center, working from an accurate map of where all the friendly guns were sitting, would calculate the correct firing data for each battery and pass those numbers out to the gun lines. The observer no longer needed to know anything about gunnery. He only needed to be able to identify a target and describe its location. The math, the geometry, the ballistics, all of it moved off the observer's shoulders and into the hands of trained specialists at a central plotting board behind the lines. It helps to picture what the Fire Direction Center actually looked like in practice, because the reality was strikingly humble for something so powerful. It was not a machine or a computer in any modern sense. It was, at its heart, a table with a map or a large sheet of gridded paper on it, called a firing chart, on which the positions of the friendly guns and the reported location of the target were carefully plotted. Around that chart worked a small team of men. One man received the observer's report and plotted the target. Others computed, using firing tables and graphical firing tables and simple instruments, the range and direction from each battery to that plotted point, and worked out the necessary corrections. A man on the telephone or radio read the resulting firing data out to the gun lines. The whole thing ran on trained human beings performing well-drilled procedures at speed, checking one another's work, converting a single reported location into a sheaf of separate firing solutions, one for each battery, in a matter of a couple of minutes. The genius was not in any single instrument. The genius was in the procedure, the division of labor, and the relentless practice that made a team able to do it quickly and correctly under the pressure of combat. This separation of tasks was the true breakthrough, and it is worth pausing on because it is the seed of everything that follows. In the older way of fighting, the man who saw the target and the process that aimed the guns were tightly bound together, often in the same battery, thinking as one. In the American system, they were split apart and connected only by a radio link or a telephone wire. The eyes and the calculating brain were now in different places, joined solely by communication. This meant that a single pair of eyes at the front could, in principle, direct the fire of any guns whose fire direction center could hear his voice. It meant that the number of guns that could respond to one observer was no longer limited by that observer's personal skill at gunnery, because he no longer did any gunnery at all. It was limited only by how many gun batteries could be tied into the same coordinating network. And once you realize that, you can see the whole future of the technique opening up. If you could tie in 12 guns, you could tie in 48. If you could tie in 48, you could, with the right organization, tie in the guns of an entire corps. The work did not stop with Brewer. Through the early and middle 1930s, other officers refined and extended the concept. A key contributor was an officer named Orlando Ward, who served in the gunnery department and helped advance the techniques after Brewer. Another central figure was Major H.L.C. Jones, who is often credited with pushing the fire direction center method toward its mature form later in the decade, developing the procedures and the equipment, including the graphical firing tables and the plotting methods that allowed the calculations to be done quickly and accurately by teams working under pressure. The refinement was continuous and collaborative, carried out by a rotating cast of instructors and students at Fort Sill across more than a decade. It was not the product of a single flash of genius, but of a sustained institutional effort, a school full of professionals worrying at the same problem year after year until they had beaten it. There was resistance. There is always resistance. Many experienced artillerymen were skeptical that this centralized approach could work in the chaos and noise of a real battlefield. The communications it required, reliable radio and telephone links between observers, fire direction centers, and gun lines, seemed fragile and unrealistic, given the equipment of the early 1930s. Some senior officers regarded the whole thing as an academic exercise, a clever solution to a problem that would dissolve into confusion the moment real shells started falling and real wires got cut. The mathematics was sound, but soundness on a plotting board at a peacetime school was one thing. Whether it would survive contact with the enemy was another question entirely, and it was a question that could not be answered until there was an enemy. The man who did more than anyone to force the new methods on the wider army was Leslie McNair. McNair was an artillery officer by background, who rose to enormous influence in the years just before and during the war. As the head of Army Ground Forces, he was responsible for organizing and training the vast American army that was raised after 1940. McNair was a believer in firepower, and specifically in artillery, and he threw his institutional weight behind the Fire Direction Center concept and the doctrine of massed, centrally controlled fire. Under his influence, the techniques worked out at Fort Sill were not left as a school curiosity, but were built into the training of the entire expanding artillery arm. When millions of American soldiers were mobilized and trained through the early 1940s, the artillerymen among them were taught the Fire Direction Center method as standard practice. This is the crucial institutional fact. The innovation did not remain the property of a handful of experts. It was industrialized, taught to a whole generation of gun crews and observers and fire direction personnel, so that by the time the American army met the Germans in strength, the entire artillery arm could do as a matter of routine what other armies could barely do at all. If accounts of the forgotten engineering behind how wars are actually won and lost interest you, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach the people who care about getting it right. Now, with the Fire Direction Center understood, we can finally answer the specific question in front of us. How did the Americans make every battery's shells hit at the same instant? The technique had a name. It was called time on target, usually shortened to TOT, and the principle behind it is beautiful in its simplicity. Once the Fire Direction Center made it possible, every shell fired from a gun spends a certain amount of time in the air before it lands. This is called the time of flight. A shell fired from a gun close to the target has a short time of flight. A shell fired from a gun far from the target, at a high angle, has a longer time of flight. The difference can be significant, several seconds or more, between a near battery and a far one firing at the same target. In the old way of doing things, if several batteries all fired at the same moment, their shells would arrive at different times, spread out over those several seconds, because the guns were at different distances. The fire would arrive as a stutter, not a single blow. Time on target reversed the logic. Instead of firing all the guns at the same moment, the fire direction centers calculated backward from the moment of impact. They picked a single instant, a target time, at which all the shells were to land. Then, knowing the time of flight for each battery, they told each battery exactly when to fire so that its shells, whatever their individual time of flight, would arrive at that one chosen instant along with everyone else's. The far battery, with the long time of flight, fired first. The near battery, with the short time of flight, fired several seconds later, and if the arithmetic was right, and it usually was, all the shells from all the batteries converged on the target in the same second, out of a clear and silent sky, with no ranging rounds, no warning, and no possibility of taking cover, because the first indication that a bombardment was coming was the arrival of its entire weight all at once. This is what the German grenadier at Elsenborn was trying to describe when he said the shelling came without warning and all at once. He was not exaggerating, and he was not confused. He was describing the deliberate mathematical design of a time-on-target strike, whose entire purpose was to eliminate the warning that had kept men like him alive on every other battlefield. The technique depended completely on three things coming together, and it is worth understanding each one, because the difficulty of assembling all three at once is exactly why other armies struggled to match it. It depended first on accurate knowledge of exactly where every friendly gun was located, down to a precise map coordinate, so that the geometry from each gun to the target could be solved correctly. This is less obvious than it sounds. Guns move constantly, and a battery that does not know precisely where it is standing cannot be tied into a coordinated network, because its firing solution will be wrong. American artillery invested enormous effort in survey, in fixing the exact position of every gun on a common grid, so that all the batteries in a network shared the same accurate frame of reference. It depended, second, on synchronized time, for batteries miles apart to fire on a schedule precise enough that their shells would converge within the same second. Their sense of time had to be coordinated with real exactness. The Americans achieved this by carefully synchronizing watches and clocks across the units involved, and by counting down together over the communications net, so that when the moment came, a far battery would loose its rounds at one instant, and a near battery would loose its own several seconds later, each on its assigned cue, all working from the same shared count. A gun that fired a few seconds early or late would throw its shells out of the pattern, and so timing discipline was drilled and drilled until it was second nature. And it depended, third, on the communications and the calculation that tied the whole thing together, the web of radios and telephone wires connecting observers to fire direction centers and fire direction centers to gun lines, and the trained teams doing the arithmetic fast enough to matter. A concentration that took an hour to arrange was useless against a target that would be gone in 10 minutes. The American system was built to compress that entire chain, from the observer's first call to the impact of the shells, into a very few minutes. Take away any one of these three legs, accurate survey, synchronized time, or fast communication and calculation, and the whole structure collapses back into the old, slow, warning-laden bombardment that every army already knew how to do. It was the combination, held together and practiced until it was routine, that made the difference. The scale at which the Americans could do this is what truly set them apart. The smallest unit of massed fire was the battalion, 12 guns firing together under one fire direction center. But the system was designed so that fire direction centers could be linked. The fire direction center controlling all the artillery organic to a division, known as division artillery, could bring together the fire of several battalions, and at the corps level, higher headquarters could reach out and pull in additional battalions of heavier guns. Because the observers and the fire direction centers were connected by communication networks, a single forward observer, a lieutenant lying in the mud with a radio, could in the right circumstances call for and receive the concentrated fire of dozens of guns, and in exceptional cases, the fire of an entire corps, all of it landing on his chosen target in the same instant. The Americans had a nickname for the very largest of these concentrations. When the guns of an entire corps or more were massed onto a single target as a time-on-target strike, it was sometimes called a serenade. It was grimly appropriate. To the men on the receiving end, a full corps serenade arriving all at once, with no warning, was very close to the end of the world. Now set this against how the Germans did things, because the contrast is the heart of the matter. The German army was not incompetent at artillery. Far from it. German gunners were skilled, their equipment was often excellent, and German artillery doctrine was in many respects highly developed. But the German system was built on different assumptions, and those assumptions cost them dearly. German artillery leaned heavily on careful, deliberate, pre-planned fire. Concentrations were surveyed and plotted in advance against likely targets, and firing on those pre-planned points could be quick and accurate. But responding to a sudden, unexpected target, in a place and at a time the plan had not anticipated, was a slower business. Massing the fire of many batteries onto a target of opportunity, quickly, in response to a single observer's call, was not something the German system did easily or routinely. Where an American observer might get the concentrated fire of many battalions onto a fresh target within a very few minutes of asking, the German equivalent could take considerably longer and often could not bring the same weight to bear at all. The reasons for this difference were partly technical and partly a matter of how each army invested its effort. It would be wrong to say the Germans could not mass artillery, because they could, and when they had time to prepare, their fire could be heavy and accurate. German artillery was a serious and professional arm, and no one who faced it thought otherwise. But the German system was optimized above all for deliberate, prepared fire under the control of senior artillery commanders, rather than for the instant, on-call massing of many scattered battalions at the request of a junior observer. The Americans had spent 15 years grinding down the specific problem of speed and responsiveness, of collapsing the time between a lieutenant seeing a target and many battalions answering him. The Germans, for all their skill, had not built their system around that particular problem in the same single-minded way, and they had neither the communications abundance nor the ammunition supply to fight that way, even had they wished to. The result was a real and repeated advantage in one specific and decisive thing. An American observer could, in the right circumstances, bring the coordinated fire of many battalions, and sometimes far more, down on a fresh target within minutes. The German army, on the whole, could not answer a sudden call with the same weight and the same speed. There is one more piece of the American arrangement that deserves attention, because it is easy to overlook, and it mattered enormously. The forward observer, the man with the eyes, was pushed far down and far forward in the American organization. He was not a rare and senior specialist held back at headquarters. Observer parties were routinely attached well forward, down at the level of the infantry battalions and companies they supported, living and moving with the frontline troops, seeing what the riflemen saw. This meant that the eyes of the artillery were everywhere the fighting was, and any one of those forward observers could reach back through the fire direction center and call for the massed fire of many batteries. The killing power of the whole artillery arm was, in effect, placed at the fingertips of junior officers scattered all along the front. A lieutenant lying in a hedgerow or a snowdrift, if he could describe what he saw and reach a radio, held in his voice the potential fire of dozens of guns. That distribution of reach, the pairing of many forward sets of eyes with a centralized brain that could answer any of them, is a large part of what made the system so responsive. The enemy could never know which patch of ground was being watched, because so much of it was. The British, for their part, were far closer to the Americans in their thinking than the Germans were, and honesty requires that they be given their due. British artillery in this war was superb, arguably the equal of the American arm in skill and organization, and the British had developed their own powerful methods for concentrating fire out of the hard lessons of the First World War. In fact, the very idea of timing the fire of many batteries so that their shells all land together, the heart of what the Americans called time on target, owed a great deal to British gunnery development. The two allies shared their methods freely and learned from each other throughout the war, and it would be wrong to paint the technique as a purely American invention. Where the Americans stood out was in how completely and how uniformly they built this responsiveness into their entire artillery arm, from the interwar work at Fort Sill down to the training of every fire direction team, and in the sheer weight of guns and ammunition they could bring to bear once a target was called. The British pioneered a great deal. The Americans industrialized it and fielded it at enormous scale. There was another factor without which none of this would have mattered, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. The Americans could afford to shoot, and to keep shooting, on a scale that beggared their enemies. A method built around drenching a target in overwhelming fire is only worth anything if you actually possess the shells to drench it. And this is where the industrial power of the United States entered the battlefield through the muzzle of every howitzer. American factories produced artillery ammunition in quantities that no other combatant could hope to match, and the American logistical machine, for all its friction and imperfection, hauled that ammunition across an ocean and up to the gun lines in a flood. American gunners fired with a liberality that astonished their allies and terrified their enemies. Where a German battery had to husband its rounds, weighing each fire mission against a dwindling stock, an American battery could answer a call for fire with a volume that assumed more shells were always coming, because they usually were. This abundance was not a lucky accident. It was the deliberate product of a nation that had turned its vast industrial economy toward war and it interlocked perfectly with the doctrine the Fort Sill men had built. The Fire Direction Center gave the Americans the ability to concentrate fire with precision and speed, to put many batteries onto one target in one instant. American industry and logistics gave them the sheer tonnage of shells that made each of those concentrations a saturating, obliterating event, rather than a brief flurry. The two halves fit together like a lock and a key. A method for delivering overwhelming fire is only as good as the supply of shells behind it, and a mountain of shells is only as good as the method for delivering them where and when they are needed. The Americans had both at once, the elegant coordinating idea and the crushing material weight, and it was the marriage of the two that produced the effect that so terrified the German infantry. Neither alone would have been enough. Together, they were something close to unanswerable. Now let us see what this complete weapon did when it met the German army in the field, because the theory only matters if it killed, and it killed on a scale that shocked even the men who wielded it. Consider first the fighting in the Normandy hedgerows in the summer of 1944, the tangled country of high earthen banks and sunken lanes, where visibility often dropped to a few yards. This was terrain that seemed designed to frustrate artillery, since an observer could rarely see far, and the enemy was concealed behind centuries-old hedges. Yet it was here that the responsiveness of the American system proved its worth. At a feature called Hill 192, near the town of St. Lo, which dominated the surrounding country and was held by tough German paratroopers, American infantry and artillery ground away at the defenders through the first half of July. The 2nd Infantry Division, which eventually took the hill, made heavy and continuous use of massed artillery, firing concentration after concentration into the German positions to keep the defenders suppressed and off balance. When the hill finally fell, the cost had been high on the American side, but the German defenders had been shattered largely by artillery, and the pattern was clear. Even in terrain that hid the enemy, the American method of drenching a suspected location in coordinated fire, rather than requiring a clean sight of every target, did the work. Then came the breakout. In late July 1944, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, the offensive that finally cracked the German line in Normandy and set the stage for the race across France. Cobra opened with a colossal aerial bombardment, but it also leaned heavily on massed artillery to tear open the German defenses and then to protect the advancing troops. The German formations facing the breakout, including the elite Panzer Lehr Division, were pounded relentlessly. Its commander, Fritz Bayerlein, later described his division being pulverized under the weight of the bombardment, reduced in effectiveness before it could even come properly to grips with the attackers. The combination of air power and massed responsive artillery broke the crust of the German defense, and once it was broken, the American army poured through and the front in the west came apart. And then, when the Germans tried to strike back, the artillery system showed what it could do against an attacker caught in motion. Consider what happened at a place called Mortagne, in Normandy, in August 1944. After the Americans broke out of the Normandy beachhead, Adolf Hitler ordered a major armored counterattack, aimed at driving west to the coast and cutting off the breakout. Several German panzer divisions were committed to this operation. It struck around the town of Mortagne, where American infantry of the 30th Infantry Division held the high ground. Most famously, elements of that division, built around a rifle battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, were surrounded and cut off on the dominating height east of the town, the hill marked on the maps as Height 314. Those men held out for days, ringed by the enemy, and a great part of the reason they held out was artillery. Forward observers up on that hill could see the German forces moving in the country below and around them, and they used what they could see. They called down concentrated fire onto the German columns and assembly areas, and the fire direction centers behind the lines answered by massing the guns of multiple battalions onto those targets. The German attack depended entirely on speed, mass, and momentum, on getting armored formations moving fast along the roads toward the sea before the Americans could react. But every time those formations bunched up on a road or gathered to press an assault, they presented exactly the kind of concentrated target the American system was designed to destroy. Fire arrived faster than the attackers could adapt to it, smashing columns before they could deploy, and breaking up assaults before they could close. The observers on the high ground turned their view of the battlefield into a stream of targets, and the guns did the rest. The counterattack that Hitler had personally ordered and expected to change the entire campaign was contained and then defeated, and the massed, responsive fire of American artillery was central to that outcome. A blow meant to reach the sea barely advanced at all, in large part because it could not survive being seen. But the engagement that shows the mature system at its most devastating came 4 months later, in the snow, at the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, on the very ground where this story began. When the Germans launched their great surprise offensive through the Ardennes in December 1944, one of their key objectives lay in the north, where they needed to break through toward the Elsenborn Ridge and open the roads beyond. The American units defending that shoulder, including the veteran 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions and the Green 99th Infantry Division, were backed by an extraordinary concentration of artillery. As the Germans attacked across the open, snow-covered approaches, American forward observers called down time on target, concentrations of a weight and suddenness that broke attack after attack. Battalion after battalion of German infantry and armor advanced into fire that arrived without warning, all at once, from guns they could not see and could not silence. The northern shoulder held, it never broke. Of all the reasons the great German gamble in the Ardennes failed, the wall of American artillery on the Elsenborn Ridge stands among the most important, and it was precisely the fire direction center system, massing many battalions onto observed targets in an instant, that built that wall. It was here too that a second piece of technology entered the story and multiplied the killing power of every time-on-target strike. To understand it, you have to understand the old geometry of taking cover from shellfire. Since the beginning of the machine age of war, an infantryman's basic protection against artillery had been the ground itself. When a shell strikes the earth and bursts, most of its fragments fly outward and upward in a low spray. A man who is flat on the ground, or down in a foxhole or a shallow trench, is largely below that spray. The earth shields him. This single fact, the protection offered by hugging the ground, had kept soldiers alive under bombardment for 30 years. It was why the veterans on the approaches to Elsenborn had learned to listen for the first round and press themselves into the dirt. The Americans, and the British who developed it alongside them, brought to the battlefield a device that erased that protection completely. It was a new kind of fuse, the part of the shell that decides when it explodes. It was called the variable time fuse, or the proximity fuse, and among the troops it picked up the nickname POSIT. Inside the nose of the shell was a tiny radio transmitter, broadcasting continuously as the shell flew. When the radio signal reflecting back off the ground told the fuse that the shell had reached the right height above the earth, typically a few tens of feet up, the fuse fired the shell automatically, in the air, above the target. This produced a reliable airburst, an explosion in the sky that rained fragments straight down onto everything below. And straight down was the one direction the old wisdom of hugging the ground offered no protection against. The foxhole that had shielded a man from a ground burst was useless against fragments falling vertically into it from above. The proximity fuse took the one reliable defense the infantryman had, getting low, and turned it into nothing. Building this device had been an immense technical achievement. The delicate radio electronics inside the shell had to survive the shock of being fired from a cannon, an acceleration of many thousands of times the force of gravity, while spinning at enormous speed. It was one of the great engineering programs of the war, carried out under intense secrecy by a scientific effort in the United States, comparable in its guarding to the effort surrounding the atomic bomb. For most of the war, the proximity fuse was restricted to use over water and later in the air defense role, most famously against German flying bombs, because the authorities feared that if a shell failed to burst and fell into enemy hands over land, the Germans might recover the technology and copy it, or devise defenses against it. So its use over land was forbidden, held in reserve, its existence a closely kept secret. That restriction was lifted during the crisis of the Ardennes. With the German offensive threatening a genuine breakthrough, the decision was made to release the proximity fuse for ground use. Once it was authorized, it was fired in enormous quantities, and it transformed every artillery concentration into something far deadlier than before. Now the time-on-target strike, already arriving without warning and all at once, arrived as a sheet of air bursts overhead, sending fragments down into the very foxholes and scrapes where men instinctively took shelter. The combination was merciless. The time-on-target technique took away the warning. The proximity fuse took away the cover. Together they left the infantryman on the receiving end, with no defense that his experience or his training had prepared him for. The effect on German soldiers, in body and in mind, was profound, and we do not have to guess at it, because the Germans told us, in their own words, at the time and afterward. The most striking testimony comes from the very top of the German officer corps. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had faced the Western Allies in North Africa and then commanded the German defences in Normandy, was blunt in his reports about what was breaking his forces. He pointed repeatedly to the crushing weight of Allied firepower, to their superiority in artillery and in the air, and to the enormous supply of ammunition behind it, as central reasons the German army could not hold. Rommel was not a man to make excuses, and he was among the most respected practitioners of mobile warfare in the entire war. When a soldier of his caliber names enemy firepower as a decisive factor, it is not a complaint, it is a professional's diagnosis. Other senior German officers said much the same. Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the elite Panzer Lehr division in Normandy, spoke with something close to despair about the effect of American artillery and air power on his formation, describing how his division was worn down under fire it could not answer. Across the German army, from field marshals to captured privates, the same theme recurs in interrogation reports and post-war accounts. American artillery was fast, it was accurate, it was overwhelming, and above all it was responsive, in a way the Germans could not match. It seemed to arrive from nowhere, in full weight, the instant a target presented itself. German commanders learned to fear the moment their troops were caught in the open, within range of American guns, because they had seen what happened next, and they had no answer to it. On the American side, the assessment of the artillery arm was equally emphatic, and it came from men not usually inclined to hand credit to anything but the fighting spirit of their soldiers. General George Patton, whose name is bound up with the dash of American armor, was unequivocal about the role of the guns. He is recorded praising American artillery in the highest terms, and about the new proximity fuse in particular he wrote, in the days after the Ardennes fighting, that it was a wonderful development, that it needed only to be heard to be believed in its effect, and that the use of this new shell would require a rethinking of how troops sheltered from artillery. Coming from a man whose heart belonged to armor, that is a striking tribute to the power of the guns. The wider Allied command took the fuse just as seriously, counting its release for ground use among the developments that helped blunt and then turn back the German offensive. Historians who have studied the campaigns in detail have reached broadly the same verdict. The scholar Michael Doubler, in his close study of how American soldiers learned to fight in Europe, identified the Fire Direction Center and the massed, responsive artillery it made possible as one of the genuine strengths of the American army, an area where American methods were clearly effective against a very skilled enemy. Many historians of the Northwest Europe campaign regard American field artillery as among the most effective combat arms the United States fielded in that theater, and captured German officers again and again singled out Allied firepower, artillery, and air power together as the thing they feared most. It would be too much to claim that every historian ranks the guns above the fighter bombers, since the two worked so closely together that separating their effects is difficult. But few would dispute that American artillery was, from an early point, genuinely world-class, and that its defining advantage was the speed and scale with which it could concentrate fire on demand. Return now to those German soldiers in the snow on the approaches to Elsenborn in December 1944, now that we understand what was happening to them. They had done everything right by the standards of the war they had learned to survive. They took cover. They listened for the first round, ready to press themselves into the earth the instant the ranging began, ready to use those few precious seconds the way they had used them many times before. But there was no first round to listen for. The fire direction centers behind the American lines had already solved the geometry for many batteries at once. They had already worked out the time of flight for each one. They had already arranged for the far guns to fire first and the near guns to fire later, so that every shell from every battery would cross the sky on its own schedule and arrive together. And many of the shells were fitted with fuses that would burst them in the air overhead, so that the ground the soldiers were hugging offered them nothing at all. They never got their seconds of warning, because the entire design of the thing that was killing them existed to make sure that no one ever would. Prisoner after prisoner described their bewilderment in almost the same words, and that shared incomprehension is the truest measure of how complete the American achievement was. In the older, familiar model of a bombardment, fire built up. It announced itself. It gave a skilled and lucky man a chance. The American model had engineered that chance out of existence. It had taken the problem of hitting an unseen target, split the seeing from the aiming, handed the aiming to a room full of trained men with plotting boards and firing tables, tied many batteries together through wire and radio and synchronized time, and calculated the whole thing backward from the single instant of impact. The German infantry had learned their whole war to read the beginning of a barrage. The Americans had abolished the beginning, and here, in that abolition, is the deeper idea that this whole story has been building toward. Two armies, both skilled, both brave, both expert in the handling of guns, held two different beliefs about what artillery fundamentally was. To the German army, at its core, artillery was a tool wielded by commanders, a powerful instrument to be aimed and directed by the judgment of skilled men close to the fight, deliberate and planned and precise. To the American army, artillery had become something else. It had become a system, a network, an idea distributed across dozens of guns and observers and calculators, in which no single man needed to be brilliant, because the brilliance had been designed into the arrangement of the whole. A German battery was a weapon. American artillery was a machine for delivering fire, in which the individual battery was only a moving part. That difference did not come from the guns, which were comparable. It did not come from the courage of the crews, which was comparable. It did not even come only from the mountain of American shells, decisive as that was. It came from an idea worked out by a handful of unglamorous officers at a poor and forgotten school on the Oklahoma plains, in the lean years when almost no one was watching. An idea that the eyes which find the target and the hands which aim the guns need not belong to the same man or stand in the same place, so long as they can speak to each other and trust the numbers that pass between them. That single act of separation, of taking the seeing apart from the aiming and reconnecting them through calculation and communication, is what let a lieutenant in a muddy hole speak a few words into a radio and bring the fire of an entire corps down on a single field in one silent, warningless, obliterating instant. The men at Fort Sill in the 1920s and 1930s did not know they were building the thing that would help break German counterattacks in Normandy and hold the line in the snow of the Ardennes. They were just professionals worrying at a hard problem in an army the world had written off. But the capability they built, taught to an entire generation of gunners and carried across an ocean, turned out to be one of the quiet, decisive advantages of the war in the West. Not a wonder weapon, not a secret, just a better way of thinking about an old problem, refined by allies who shared in its development, and then fielded at a scale and a speed no enemy could match. The German soldiers in the snow never learned its name. They knew only that the sky had come apart above them all at once, without warning, and that nothing they had learned in years of surviving had been of any use at the end. If this account gave you something to think about, a like helps it reach more people who care about the history behind how these battles were actually decided. And subscribing means you will not miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and thank you for taking the time to get the story right.